Welcome everyone. I'm Eve Samples, Executive Director at Friends of the Everglades. We're here with a live and in-person clean water conversation. It's the first one of these that we've done with guests under our roof, and it's a really important discussion we're going to have today about the new Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, better known as LOSOM. So I'm going to introduce our guests here today. First, we have Colonel James Booth. He's the Jacksonville District Commander for the Army Corps of Engineers, has played a really important role in overseeing the development of LOSOM for the past 9 months or so. Is that right?
Months,
11 now. Okay, time flies when you're developing a new lake plan, I guess. We also have Tim Geisen, who is the project manager for LOSOM for the Army Corps of Engineers. And we're going to be talking with these folks for about an hour, as well as Gil Smart, our policy director at Friends of the Everglades. And then we'd like to tackle as many of your questions as we can in the last 15 minutes or so. So if you're joining us live on Facebook or on YouTube, please submit your questions in the comments, and we'll go through those toward the end of our conversation. So welcome, everybody. Really happy to have you here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's been a long road with the development of the new Lake Okeechobee plan. The plan we've been living under for the past 12 years, I believe it is, has brought us toxic algae discharges on both coasts, has really not delivered on water to the southern end of the system in the way that I know we at Friends of the Everglades would have liked to have seen. And you've been working on a new improved lake plan. And we have some more flexibility now because the Herbert Hoover Dyke has been rehabilitated. So I'm going to ask you, Colonel Booth, to kind of give us a quick overview of this journey, 3 years plus, and working on a new lake plan that we do think will be better. So how do we get to this point?
So absolutely. You've mentioned the Herbert Hoover Dyke being the kind of the key difference here. Repairs or restoration of the Herbert Hoover Dyke, or before that, drove us to establish the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule, LOSOM. Right, more of a constrained operating schedule based on not being able to hold as much water in Lake Okeechobee, which meant we would do these releases more often and with higher flows because we were really focused. That was much more constrained against dam and levee safety. As we have gotten through the 15 years of restoration work on Herbert Hoover Dyke, we timed the Lake Okeechobee Systems Operating Manual, LOSOM, to coincide with completion of that levee restoration. And so we look at LOSOM as more of a benefits-based approach. So the goal as we developed the plan was to make sure we utilize as much flexibility as we possibly could, and then balance out our project purposes, our authorized project purposes. And so that's what we've been doing. One of the other things we really focused on over the last 3.5 years was public and agency organization engagement and involvement. And I think we've been very, very successful at that. The district has really kind of changed their culture. And how we approach being interactive and getting feedback as we develop this plan. So this last 2 weeks, we rolled out the draft environmental impact statement and water control plan on the 29th of July. And we're taking feedback on that as part of the NEPA process until the 12th of September. And we've been out driving all over South Florida and doing meetings, virtual meetings, asking for that feedback and generating conversations over the last 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm. And this is the last stop on your road show, so we're honored to host you. Can you just give us a flavor on some of the feedback you've received?
Sure. I think the number one piece of feedback we got, which was a lot of thanks to the Corps for how we executed the process, being open and transparent and giving folks a voice. That was the number one piece of feedback. And I'd say broadly, the second piece of feedback we got was where previous schedules have been very lines on a diagram. When you hit this lake stage, you will do this. We've taken with LOSOM, as we've tried to build in that operational flexibility, we've tried to describe all the things we consider as we make changes in our release schedule in words, as opposed to hard lines that drive hard decisions. That has generated, and we are hearing and recognize that's generating discomfort almost across the board from all stakeholders. And so we're looking at how do we go back as we revise and draft, acknowledging that feedback and making folks feel a little more comfortable. But I think no stakeholder is going to be fully comfortable because we haven't really achieved everything that any individual stakeholder wants.
Mm-hmm. I think we fall into that category too. So we appreciate the increased flexibility that we've seen in the new lake plan. But that flexibility can be a double-edged sword because while LOSOM anticipates benefits to the estuaries, reduced harmful discharges to the St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee, increased flows south. With that flexibility, we're not guaranteed that we'll realize them. So I just want to ask you how we can make sure or increase the likelihood of realizing those benefits that you've anticipated.
Sure, and Tim can jump in here. I will say broadly, I think it's in the draft. It's there. The water control plan is there. That certainty that folks were looking for in an old document with line and blocks and decisions, we've described in language. Though I acknowledge it's 60-page document, but there's about 7 or 8 pages in there that really get to describing when we're at different lake stages, the things that we're considering, and it describes where in that lake stage we're at, the elevation of water on the lake, and the considerations that we're taking into account. So it's all in there and it's described, and that document is the playbook. It is it's how we modeled it. It's what the environmental impact statement is drafted around, is that modeling. And then we've just taken those models that people, I think we're fairly recognize that we've done a good job with, and it's describing in words what the model data shows in the EIS. And so it's there, but we just acknowledge we've got to do a better job of messaging and looking at some of the language we use. Mm-hmm. And so I think we're comfortable that what the models plan to deliver, that folks are really trying to hold tight to, I think that the water control plan describes that, and we intend to operate that way. We just maybe do some tweaks in the language and continue the conversation, but it's in there.
Yeah, and I guess for the benefit of our audience, we should explain what those anticipated benefits are. So an expected tripling of flows south to the southern Everglades compared to existing conditions under the new lake plan. Although in the Corps' own words, those benefits will really be negligible ecologically. So the Everglades still need even more water is what we take from that. Also a pretty dramatic reduction in harmful and damaging discharges to the St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee estuaries, which of course we're grateful for. We noticed, I think for the first time ever in a lake plan, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you actually talk about toxic algae, harmful algal blooms. I don't think this was ever a formal consideration in past lake plans. I know you had an exception at one point, right. A deviation, but yeah, so this is a first as well. So for those of you who are listening, who lived through the toxic summer of 2018, 2016, 2013, before that, we can expect improvements over those conditions if the modeled benefits are realized. So on that note, we'd like to ask you about how past conditions would have been different if we were living under LOSOM. So let's go back to 2016. If in 2016 we were living under this Lake O plan, would we have experienced the kind of toxic algae that we certainly saw here in Stewart that year?
And so I'll talk a little more broadly, and I'm definitely going to jump in and have Tim back me up with maybe some data. But broadly, if you look at, I think, what we call the lost summer of 2013 or 2016, if you the LOSOM plan, as we modeled it, looked at a period of record of about 52 years running up until 2016. So we've got model data that shows how LOSOM would compare to how we would operate under LORS. And what you see is that the lost summer of 2013, though it would have triggered flows under LOSOM, much fewer. I think it's only, what was the number, Tim, if you remember, hold on 1 second. 2 months of flow would have occurred during that summer in 2013. If you look at, but you also could take into account that LOSOM would have the harmful algal bloom operations to make a decision, okay, if we've got blooms going on, can we delay a release? Because we've got higher capacity in the dike to hold water for a little more time. We could potentially let a bloom that might have flowed under LORS, previous or current operating schedule, hold off until it's dissipated before we'd have to do that releases. But a significantly lower flow in 2013. Now, a year like 2016, there was a heavy flow in the winter and then continuing on through the summer. So in that situation, what we would have been able to do under LOSOM is receive that water and release it during the dry season. But those would still trigger about 3 months of flows just because of the volume. LOSOM is not a panacea solve all,
Right.
especially when you get these large amounts of water in the system. And then the flows in the summer, if I remember correctly, would have been reduced down to about 4 or 5 months of flow in the summer. But once again, under LOSOM, we've got harmful algal bloom operations to take into account that could have mitigated. Oh, and I apologize. If you look back in the winter, in the winter, you don't have as much of a concern for harmful algal blooms, right? And it's a good time, winter being generally what we call the dry season, a good time to get those flows out and the capability to get it elsewhere in the system for beneficial use.
Right.
In that large zone D that we talked about.
Meaning south and west.
South, west,
never
east
for beneficial.
Well, yeah, I apologize.
From our
Yes.
perspective.
Yes,
yeah.
yes. And when we talk beneficial flows, that's where we're considered up to 2,000 along the Caloosahatchee, as much as we can, that we can get down south during those time frames.
So if I can just jump in real quick,
Sure.
we still would have seen significant flows, but one of the main differences it sounds like you're saying is that the algal bloom operation, you would have had the ability to say, hey, look, there's a whole bunch of algae right here at the lock, we can hold off for a minute, that sort of thing. So
change the timing of the flow.
Right. So theoretically, there might have been less algae in the discharges we did receive, which theoretically could have led to less algae in the estuary. So.
Yeah, we do like that flexibility because in years past, what we saw was we'd have a big tropical system go over Lake Okeechobee. The lake would light up with an algae bloom. The lake levels would rise. The Army Corps would be nervous about the dike integrity and just open the gates because it was that trigger, right? That number triggered it instead of letting the bloom dissipate and become less toxic. So we do appreciate seeing that flexibility.
And that is the difference in the scenarios, right? We had to make sure that the dike stability. We saw that heavy rainfall in the late 90s, early 2000s was actually carrying sediment away from the embankment, right? A bad situation, that's gone. We spent 15 years and billions of dollars fixing that. And so we have a better situation in how we're operating Lake under LOSOM now, which is tremendous. And though we say, hey, there's going to be, even in a year like 2016 under LOSOM, we would still have to have flows.
Right.
The key here is that what's continuing in the future, and that gets to comprehensive Everglades restoration. The additional infrastructure that we're looking at through CERP allows in the future to continue to look at ways of reducing the amounts of flows that would, in these scenarios, have to go east or west with high water.
Right, because we're really constrained now still by the capacity of the stormwater treatment areas south of the lake. So that's about 60,000 acres of man-made marshes where water can flow south. And typically in the rainy season, those are full with runoff from sugarcane farms. And during the dry season, there's a couple months where the South Florida Water Management District, which controls them, likes to let them recover so that they can be in better health. Sitting here as an advocate for Friends of the Everglades and for the Northern Estuaries, that can be very frustrating that the STAs are sitting there empty, recovering when we would like to see water moving south to help the Everglades and also lowering the lake so that we reduce our odds of discharges when the rainy season comes around. So yeah, I wanted to ask you, you both represent the Army Corps of Engineers, not the South Florida Water Management District, which is your state partner, but is there anything that you can do as a partner to increase the flows south?
I think in the long term under CERP, certainly, as we're looking at the Everglades Agricultural Area Reservoir, as well as the STA, I think it was the A2 STA, that's under construction by South Florida. That's the longer term fix. If you look at the relationship between Jacksonville District at the federal level, the United States Army Corps of Engineers, and the state representative, South Florida Water Management District, we operate shoulder to shoulder. We have got an incredible relationship with their staff, and I have full trust and confidence in their capabilities and understanding of the STAs to make sure that they're utilizing to the best of their capability. And they do run them hard during the wet season, treating generally the local rainfall or runoff. And when they need to give them that rest, the big problem with an STA, if you have a die-off in that vegetation, the amount of time it takes to regrow that vegetation and have it ready to where it can actually do treatment is not insignificant. And so they are the experts at it. We trust with how they're operating and maintaining them, and we're confident that will continue in the future.
Yeah, it roughly, just so our audience is aware, only about 10% of the water coming into the STAs every year is from the lake. The rest is for largely sugarcane runoff. So yeah, that's something we talk a lot about. Think a lot about the need for more STA so that we can send more clean water south when it's needed to the southern end of the system.
Tim, is there anything else?
Yeah, I wanted to add one thing. So I think it's really important with the way LOSOM is able to provide beneficial or no flows, especially to the East Coast, that actually provides resiliency for the estuary. So if you look at the modeled data, we're in the no flow to the East Coast zone 80% of the time. And as we were talking about 2016, leading up to that, in the 10 years previous, the modeling shows 4 months in 10 years where the St. Lucie received flows. And 2 of those were 2013, where we had the ability under LOSOM with harmful algal bloom operations, as well as the ability to kind of take a look at where we are in the wet season and how close we are to the dry season to potentially not release even the releases that the model showed. So that period where there's no flow to the estuary provides resilience. And I think that's true with the Caloosahatchee as well, where we're providing beneficial flows to expect the salinity conditions, which provides resilience to the seagrasses and the oyster beds and things like that. So that's another really big benefit, I think, of LOSOM is the resiliency in the system, that getting the right flows or no flows really can provide to the ecology.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing it right now in the St. Lucie River, not because the new lake plan's in effect, but just because we've been lucky with the weather the last couple of years. Juvenile conch are out there, some seagrass is growing back, and the system really can recover when you don't dump toxic water on
You
it.
give it a chance, nature comes back, right? But you have to give it a chance. It's a thing, so yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So to explain a little bit more about what Tim was saying, in the new lake plan, up to almost 17 feet, the St. Lucie receives no discharges, which is a significant change compared to the existing lake plan. And then the Caloosahatchee will get up to 2,000 cubic feet per second. And someone once told me that's like a football. Think of a football of water as a cubic foot. So, and that's actually needed at certain times of the year to the West Coast. So unlike the Caloosahatchee, the St. Lucie never needs flows from the lake. So it is an improvement. And again, we're hopeful that those anticipated benefits will materialize. So that brings me to a question about Lake Okeechobee recovery mode.
Sure.
So this new plan anticipates, because it will hold the lake higher, that to let the lake ecology recover, you would intentionally draw it down. And can you walk us through what that would look like, what the triggers are?
Sure. So broadly, what we're talking about is if we've seen, what we do know about the Lake Okeechobee ecology is when you get these higher periods of holding the lake high, so let's say over 17 feet, that obviously shades the subaquatic vegetation, just the similar issues of what you would have in the estuaries with seagrasses. And you'll have die off, or you could have a storm come through and have some pretty heavy impacts on that. And so what we're looking at is taking into account a lot of factors, but if Lake Okeechobee is sat with high water for significant periods of time, looking at, can we draw the water down to a point where we can get that sunlight through in some of the areas so that they can get at least the initiation of regrowth of subaquatic vegetation. That's generally the concept. And I'll have Tim come in with more specifics, but what we're looking at that time frame is, okay, to draw the lake down, how do we continue almost the flow in beneficial areas under the recover schedule? If we talk to the east, flows that are not harmful to the estuaries, and measure it at a point where we take into account all the flow that comes into the St. Lucie, and find if there's room in that to continue to flow some lake water out through the St. Lucie. It basically flows in all directions to bring that lake level down below, I'm looking on my feet,
12.8, 12.5.
And so it's trying to get it low for, there's two different, but basically for 60 to 90 days to give subaquatic vegetation a chance to breathe is not the right term, but regenerate. And so that's the general concept. And I'll hand it over to Tim for some more of the specifics that we're actually considering in that.
Sure, and I think that one really key point with lake recovery is that it's not triggered by the schedule. There's no hard line in the schedule that says if you hit this, we're going into lake recovery. continuing on the collaborative process and the interactive process with the other agencies and with the public that we've done during the planning for LOSOM, that would continue as we move into implementation. And we would come together and talk about the conditions in the system and determine, is it actually a time to do a lake recovery operation? Looking at the state of the estuaries, have they been hit hard recently? It's probably not a good idea to continue to push releases out. Or do we see conditions where it's projected to have very low rainfall into the coming year? You may not want to purposely bring the lake down because that could drive it into a water shortage phase. So I think there's a lot of considerations that go into looking at the actual conditions at any one time when you even consider doing a lake recovery operation. And the intention is to bring everybody together and talk about it and make sure that if we do decide it's time, that we're taking into account all the factors and making a smart choice before we actually.
So if I can ask then, just for the benefit of the people who haven't been steeping in sort of the scientific data and the jargon, what does that look like on the ground? In other words, if you have a lake at 17 feet and you want to take it down to 12.8 feet, about how long a period are you going to see discharges for? Will it be continuous like every day, this amount of discharges, or will it be pulsed? Will it be paused at any point? What does it look like?
So yeah, I mean, that's a lot of water, right? 5 feet of water in the lake is quite a bit to get out. Yeah, and I think there's different ways you can go about that. Part of that may be natural dry down during the dry season through evapotranspiration, water usage. It could be continuous releases up to those recover set release amounts, or it may be pulse releases. And I think that's part of the discussion as you go into this is what's the best way to do it? How can we accomplish the goal? Because if you can't accomplish the goal to get down to provide that recovery, then do you really even want to start doing it? So I think that's all part of the discussion before we even get into a recovery operation is how do we want to do it to accomplish the goal, and will it be successful? Because I think that we all want to be successful and not cause harm to other parts of the system.
And the key to the approach is we looked at it was scientifically based. So it was, we modeled it, we looked at different ways that you could do that. Do you do it with high flows? Are you looking at it in the wet season? Are you doing it in the dry season? When we ran all those numbers and looked at it in several different ways, what was really settled on were these moderate level of flows focused during the dry season, where there's need in the system. Like Tim said, you get the evapotranspiration. And so it's a scientifically based approach, but also there's flexibility in when you apply it. There's not a hard trigger. There's a conversation that's there. There's a discussion to make sure that conditions make sense, and it's a reasonable approach.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, it does make us nervous.
Sure.
I think that the concern is that when we were modeled to have such great benefits, but when Lake Okeechobee recovery mode is implemented, it could wipe out those benefits if we're implementing it too often and
Sure.
too aggressively. And also we wonder what the true benefits to the lake will be. Nobody wants to see the lake suffer, and we all know that we need more storage and treatment south of the lake to avoid that. And look, the lake has been treated as a reservoir for decades, and that's part of why lake ecology is currently suffering. However, I think weighing the cost and benefit is going to be really important. So, I mean, I guess I want to ask about those decisions. The flexibility we've talked about is good for the most part. But that's going to put a lot of pressure on the Corps to make these difficult decisions in the moment. How do you foresee those playing out? What forum? Is that all to be decided?
We're working through that. And we've gotten this kind of feedback over the last 2 weeks, and we expect to get more of it. And it's getting to more some of the specificity of, okay, if we are looking at strategies throughout the entire season. We're almost having 3 different strategy sessions throughout the season. And so, Tim, if I'm off on this, remind me, beginning of the dry season, at a midpoint in the dry season, and then as we transition into the wet season. And so not just looking every week by week, which we're doing, but at these strategy points throughout the entire season, looking deep, seeing what the climate is, what the climate predictions are, what are the current weather, what are the conditions in the system, or the past 6 months, the next 6 months are expected to make good, reasonable decisions. And I think that process plays out not only for just release decisions, but also recovery mode type of operations or allowable.
And who's at the table when you're making those decisions?
And so I will be broad, and then so what we're looking at right now is a periodic science call as part of the weekly process. And you got South Florida Water Management District, their water managers and leadership involved in the typical decision process. And then on a weekly basis, all our team is involved as well. So there's constant communication amongst all those. Would be something very similar in the strategy sessions. I don't necessarily know if the document fleshes it out to that level quite yet.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the feedback that we've heard is what's that actually going to look like, and how can we improve the process we already have to make it more clear and be more inclusive? Because I think that's also a big part of it is continue the communication so people know what's going on and are able to provide feedback real time. So those periodic scientist calls, as Colonel mentioned, those are open to the public. There's a public comment period. So the continued participation from all of the different stakeholder groups, continuing to provide real-time information on conditions on the ground is going to be part of that process as well.
And the buck stops with you or whoever's sitting in
Sure.
your seat in the future, right?
Absolutely.
To make that call.
It is it's the federal decision basically throughout most of the schedule.
Right.
As long as we're not in the water shortage management zone.
Right. And so when the lake gets down into the water shortage management zone, then any release decisions fall to the South Florida Water Management District. And that's the case right now, right?
There's no significant change
No
there.
change there. Okay. Let's see. I want to talk a little bit about the southern end of the system because while we're based in Stewart at Friends of the Everglades, of course, we think a lot about Everglades National Park. And I mentioned at the outset that you're anticipating tripling flows south compared to the existing conditions to the park. So that you characterize as negligible. So why aren't we able to see more flows south?
I think any flow south is a significant change in the system, and we don't want to downplay that. Where you look at the negligible impacts on environmental lift improvements really comes in the fact you got to look towards comprehensive Everglades restoration, which gets the distribution right. The increased flows give us timing under LOSOM and as well as quantity, but we're also looking at the distribution where you're putting it. And LOSOM doesn't have the capability to influence that. And that's where we really get for the Central Everglades, that environmental impact. And so you start to transition to look at, okay, what are we doing under SERP that gets after that? And that's the Central Everglades Planning Project, or CEP. And in particular, addressing, there's a lot of dry out that happens in the dry season in the northwestern corner of Water Conservation Area 3A. As a good example, when you get into the dry season, the way that the changes have been made to the system through the central and southern Florida system, that area tends to dry out in the dry season. And so the CEP North targets changing that distribution, our capability to create a demand for that water that comes down to that area. That would obviously be tied to the Everglades agricultural area, reservoir and STA, but as well as there's potential if we do, South Florida Water Management District is really taking the lead on the CEP North feature. If they are able to get into construction on that, we could look at getting distribution in that direction, potentially ahead of Everglades Reservoir or STA. And so it's replumbing the rest of that system through CEP North, CEP South, a little bit lower, that allows us to get the flow in the right locations to really have that additive benefit. So we got, once again, LOSOM gets us the timing and the quantity. Now we've got to work through Everglades restoration to look at distribution.
And of course, water quality is a huge factor too.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
And it's something we think a lot about. Friends of the Everglades has been involved in litigation over the years to set limits on phosphorus south. And I know that's not something the Army Corps of Engineers is in charge of, but it's a constraint you have to live with, right?
We operate in that environment. We acknowledge water quality is important.
Yeah.
That's why we talk about HAB operations
Right.
and LOSOM. Tim, did I miss anything?
No, I think you covered it. I think the only thing I would add is just to kind of remind folks in LOSOM how the modeling was done. So we assumed infrastructure that was on the ground currently or coming up or already under construction, the C44 reservoir, which is complete now, and C43 reservoir. We did not have any of the CEP infrastructure as part of the modeling in LOSOM, as opposed to the SERP projects that build upon already authorized projects. So we don't see the benefits, as Colonel Booth said, of spreading that water out and getting it to those places where the CEP projects were designed to do. So we're getting more water. It's just not getting to those places yet until that set of infrastructure is done. And the models show that.
Okay, and this lake plan is supposed to last 10 years, right? So we'll do it all over again once that's online. the new infrastructure.
And that's why we're in this process. As conditions change, as infrastructure changes in the system, we go back and look at how we're operating. And so we'll certainly go back into that process when the timing's right. We've got enough infrastructure to change how we're operating.
Yeah.
And if something changes in the interim, we have flexibility within the system to continue to acknowledge that change.
Yeah.
And it gets back to, I think, that transition we talked with LOSOM, utilizing what we have right now, with CERP getting after what we need to get after true continued restoration and get the benefits. Organizations like yours and throughout the South Florida, advocacy for what you deem important is very helpful to us as we look to continue that mission. We look for authorization from Congress and funding from Congress, what Congress tells us to do. We're going to get after it.
Yeah.
But I think y'all's advocacy is very important.
Thank you. And I know we've inundated your inbox from time to time.
I was talking to y'all last night. My current count is 1,600 letters direct to my inbox.
And those aren't all from us.
No.
Okay.
There's a lot of interest that wants to send the letters.
Yeah. No, and to
And
those
you
of
read
you,
every single one.
Well, I read it, but if it's the same letter, I don't read it over and over again.
Right, fair enough. And there are a lot of people who really care deeply about a better lake management plan because we've lived the consequences of a bad plan, at least bad for the environment, bad for public health, good for protecting the dike. And I just want to remind our audience that if you have questions, please put them in the chat on YouTube or Facebook, and we'll get to as many of those as possible in our home stretch here. So I just want to ask you about the Herbert Hoover Dyke rehabilitation, because it's a massive project that has gotten us to this point with the new lake plan. How much did it cost? What is it, 143 miles around? Just describe the scope of that.
Sure.
Project,
And we have so much in Jacksonville District. Sometimes scope is hard, but I know it's 1.6 billion. 100 million of that from the state. The rest is federal. The significant effort was we have culverts that go through the dike. You'll hear me call it embankment as well. And what we went through is to make sure and shore those up, either replace them or remove them. And that was a significant effort in the 30s. I'm going to be off on the numbers, and I won't be right on the number of miles. The next significant change throughout the embankment is we basically went to the center of the embankment and dug an almost 2-foot wide ditch 60 feet down, right through the center of the embankment. And placed, it's called a soil bentonite mix. It's effectively something between a clay layer and a concrete layer. If you touch it, that's about what it feels like. And basically poured that in there and let it set up, and then restored the embankment around that. And so effectively what that does is make water that would easily flow through the embankment now has to go below 60 feet. It slows down. It's not carrying sediment with it away from the embankment. Makes it much safer. And so that's what's taken 15 years, is to do all that work, to do it right, to make sure that the folks that are living around the dike are taken care of for their life, safety, and property. It was the right thing to do. It just takes a lot of time to get there.
I think it was after Hurricane Katrina that the Corps got really concerned about all of its structures and
Absolutely
started that work. And years ago, the Corps higher-ups wouldn't say for sure if the rehabilitation would let you hold more water in the lake, or if we would get to this point. But now, in the new lake plan, I mean, that's where we're headed, right? You're comfortable with holding the lake higher.
I can't say what we would or wouldn't speak to before. I think what we do know now is we're completing construction on several segments, and we've gone back in and done the assessment on, did we achieve what we expected? And so we have a process that rates a dam or a levee on its safety. Herbert Hoover Dyke was a 1, which means it's the worst condition.
Yeah.
That's as low as it's the worst you could be. What we want to get to is a 4. And we're seeing the dam safety levy, it's called DSAC, and I'm not going to tell you what the acronyms correctly, but the sections that we've assessed after construction are being assessed at a 4. And so we know we're having the impact, we're delivering what we thought we were going to deliver. And so we're confident the last set of assessments occur in December, right as we're finishing up, that all the segments will come in as a DSAC 4. And that's really that, once again, that trigger that allows us to transition into the LOSOM plan.
Had the dike been at risk of significant failure when it was one?
It was at risk. And so what we did to mitigate that risk is we changed to lures. And so we held the level of the lake lower, which you were been talking about the impact, right? We didn't have as much flexibility to hold water, and thus we would release it. But as another mitigating factor, when the lake would get above 15.5 feet, we would get into a process of weekly, and as it increased, even daily inspections of going out there and looking at the known risk areas, and we're watching it as another way to mitigate that risk and make sure that folks living around the facility felt comfortable until we got the restoration complete. So we were confident that we could continue to operate in its condition. We just had a lot more efforts in place to make sure that we weren't seeing additional risks, or we identified them early enough that we could act and not have a catastrophic type.
One of the things we advocated for under the current lake plan was getting the lake as low as you could ahead of June 1st, so that you wouldn't be in a position to dump east and west. And so, of course, that created a tension with water supply advocates, mainly, almost 500,000 acres in sugarcane south of the lake. So talk about the Army Corps' role in that kind of tension between water supply and ecological needs.
Absolutely. So the way I describe it is, most people are giving us their perspective. That perspective is not wrong per se. There's science that backs up a lot of perspectives of how we're impacting the St. Lucie estuary, how we're impacting the Caloosahatchee, how we're impacting the southern Everglades, how we're impacting water supply, navigations that get slow. Those perspectives and where folks get frustrated are not wrong. However, at the federal level, the Jacksonville district has to balance all those perspectives and get a holistic view of what's going on and how we should operate the lake. And that's really what LOSOM is trying to do, is find balance in there. And so we've heard some folks say, even yesterday, I think y'all were there, but, no one's happy, which means you're probably in the right place. Those weren't my words, but that's a good description of that process, is to make sure that we're looking at everything, acknowledging we're probably not going to make anybody happy, but we're going to get folks closer to where their interests lie. LOSOM's not perfect, but we're using the best. We're getting the best benefit out of the infrastructure we have right now, while we wait for other infrastructure to come.
Interesting. I said this last night in my comments in the meeting was, a lot of the stakeholders come at this from the perspective of what could happen, what might happen under LOSOM. This region comes at this from the perspective of what has happened in the past, what the effect of previous lake management has done to the estuary and this community. So we've been there,
Absolutely.
To kind of build on top of that, and I think that our authority from Congress is we have these project purposes and to balance them, but we have pretty broad discretion to see what that balance looks like. And that's what LOSOM has been all about. It happens all the time. Perspectives change, the needs of the state change. But that's why being able to work in a collaborative process like this and really understand the perspective on balance and get to a point where we're kind of got a common vision of what that balance looks like right now. That's kind of our job, is to work within that and get everybody together on what that balance should look like.
I think balance looks a lot less balanced if previously you benefited from the imbalance.
I gotta think about that. So how does the Army Corps decide what is appropriate water supply deliveries to the EAA farmers? How do you decide what's a good level?
Mm-hmm.
Speaking as the Army Corps of Engineers.
Sure, and I think we've put some language in here, and I will not be able to quote it appropriately. But we recognize the state of Florida has the authority for appropriation of water supply. That's what the South Florida Water Management District does, and we acknowledge that, and don't see any daylight between us at any call for water, any decision on water allocation. We're not going to get it in front of and challenge. That's the state's authority, and we've tried to describe that in the language that we put into LOSOM.
Yeah.
And so.
It is clear in the language, if you read the draft plan, that the state of Florida makes water supply decisions. So thank you for confirming that. And to the extent that we think that water supply deliveries are overly generous and harmful to the Everglades, that's something we have to push our state policymakers on and and the Corps really defers to the state on that point. So thank you. All right, here's kind of a, I don't want to call it a softball, but I think I know the answer.
I'll take
but
softballs.
I know that some people watching will have this question. So there have been calls to just close the gates east and west when toxic algae is above the levels that's deemed safe for exposure by humans. Why can't we just keep the gates closed from the lake when we see those kinds of toxic algae levels?
Sure, absolutely. And it will go back to what we've already discussed, which is when the embankment, when the dike was in a degraded state, particularly, you could see why we had to make a decision of releasing water because the threat to life, health, and safety of the many people that live around the lake is a key and critical importance. And where we make a decision to flow harmful algal blooms over letting an embankment fail. And so now that we've improved the safety, we have the harmful algal bloom operations in our schedule now that allows us to go, okay, we can change our timing. We may need to flow because we're getting a lot of water in, but we're comfortable with the safety of the levee or the embankment. And so that allows us to make that decision. So really to get back to your, why can't you close the gate? It's really a decision between life, health, and safety for human life of the failure of the dam, as opposed to what we are considering now, which is life, health, safety with the impacts of harmful algal blooms. So we acknowledge that. And I think we've got more flexibility to operate with harmful algal blooms in the future.
Yeah, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but from what you said previously, why can't you just close the gates? You might be able to close the gates for a little bit, depending on a variety of factors that could mitigate the algae coming into the estuary.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah. It really comes down to, does it just need more time to burn off?
Mm-hmm.
Does the state of Florida want to come in and do a treatment to improve the water quality? There's a lot of different things that we can take into consideration. What kind of weather patterns are coming in?
Right.
And so what would that impact on lake stages? So there's just a lot. We've got more flexibility now.
Yeah, and we do like that improvement, although I'll just add that we're very cognizant of the fact that polluted freshwater, even with no algae in it, is damaging to the estuaries. But of course, we'd rather not have algae. So this is an improvement over what we're living with now. All right, here's maybe a harder question for you. And then I think we'll ask the audience for some questions. What's the highest lake levels can go with the dike rehabilitated, the Herbert Hoover dike?
When you said the highest they can go, we can hit triggers when we're going to start ramping up releases.
Right.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question, and it's really all about risk, and that's really what the rehabilitation did, was lower the risk. That doesn't mean we're going to hold 3 feet more water in the lake. It's not built to do that. So the top of the schedule line, where we would trigger the highest releases, is the same under LOSOM as it is under LORS, and that doesn't change. That it's the risk of getting up to that and having to make those releases and the safety of the dam that's really come down quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. So the highest lake levels in recent history have been what, like 17-foot range? What's the highest the lake?
It's always dangerous asking a guy who's been here for 11 months.
Recent history is very short.
History for me, I think we got to 16.5 this year.
Yeah.
It's been over 17 in the past decade.
Right. So could we foresee it getting to 18 with the dike rehabilitated? Because you all will feel more comfortable holding that water?
Or would that be more of a factor of inflow into the lake and it might go up that high,
That's exactly what it is. It's climate. When you're talking those very high lake stages, it's all influenced by the climate, how much rain, how many storms did we get. So that's, of course, unpredictable, but I wouldn't say there's any more chance of getting up that high now than there would be if they're under LORS.
Right, because I think most people probably understand more water can flow into Lake Okeechobee than we can get out of Lake Okeechobee, east, west, south. Yeah. We don't have the capability. So that's why when you get to those higher stages on our schedule, you see us increasing flows. And we get to, I think that's BC's, we're getting close in zone BC, so we're ramping up. And if we get to zone A, we're as fast as we can with safety and flooding impacts. But the lake could raise higher even doing that, just because more flow could be coming into the
Right.
Kissimmee Channel ends or directly onto.
You have more freeboard, right? I think that's.
There's more freeboard. That's correct.
Okay, gotcha. All right, so we'll take some questions from the audience if we have any now. So again, we're here with Colonel Booth from the Army Corps of Engineers and Tim Geisen. He's project manager for the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual. And while we're waiting for some questions to be queued up here, I just want you to think about next steps, but we'll get to that in a minute. So we do have a question from Ed Killer. Ed Killer is a wonderful outdoors writer. You're on the Treasure Coast. Some of you may know him. He wants to know, how will LOSOM handle 3 feet of lake rise, such as after Irma?
Well, I think that depends on what stages you start with at 3 feet. If that 3 feet of rise occurs within what we're calling Zone D and doesn't bring the lake stage up into Zone B or C, we would keep 0 releases to the east, up to 2,000 to the west, and whatever's available south. And so I think that really gets at, if we're in that really wide Zone D, which we basically increased our capability of our flexibility in that zone, that would be the effect. We would not exceed those. If that 3 feet pushes us up into the higher zones, then we just have to start escalating the flows, because then we start to switch into a dam and levee safety focus, as opposed to using the benefits of that 3 feet in the Zone D.
Okay, great. Thanks for the question, Ed. We can go to the next question. All right, this is from Stingray727. This doesn't sound like a real name. Current day forecasts appear more accurate. Does the more accurate forecast help determine the lake levels in planning for a tropical system? So today's forecasting is better than it was a decade or 2 ago, I'm sure. How does that factor in?
I think it comes down to, yes, we've got better information that allows us to make better decisions. Tim's been talking a lot. There's a lot of things we're taking into consideration every week. Is it long-range climate? Is it current weather forecasts? But we certainly, because we can see storms coming off the African coastline way before we used to be able to, that we can make more informed decisions. But recognize, just like we've talked about, and many people pointed out, as soon as a hurricane comes off the African coast, we could make decisions to go full releases in Lake Okeechobee, but that wouldn't necessarily make enough room in the lake to handle a full tropical storm that was direct over. And so really, it just informs, okay, what could be coming. It's informing our decisions, but we're still watching these storms come across. We don't just go freak out when we see a hurricane coming. We've got time to watch it with the safety of Lake Okeechobee and the Hoover Dyke after improvements. We've got capability to be flexible, make smart decisions with the information that we have, and we don't just make decisions based on the current weather. We're looking at the climate we're looking forward weeks, months, half a year to a year out to understand what decisions, looking back at the decisions we've made in the past to also inform the impacts of the changes we make.
Pivoting off those last 2 questions, is there ever a time when you would make releases in anticipation of going into above Zone D, for example? If we were at 15.5 feet and you knew a storm was coming, barreling down on us, is there a scenario in which there would be?
I think there's always a scenario where you could be there, but that scenario would probably be similar to if we'd had a lot of wet, either tropical activity or we're in the late wet season. We've got a lot of rain in the system. We're already at high stages. We probably are already releasing when you're trying to continue releases in anticipation of more coming in. So yes, I think there's always a scenario where we could, but recognizing in a period of a couple of weeks, we're not making significant impacts on lake stage. It takes weeks to months to really have impact.
Yeah, and reading the draft lake plan, I noticed there's some language that says if you're moving into one zone, you can act as if you're already there. But I can't remember if it's when you're going up or down.
It's both. I think you can kind of see where you are in the schedule, what time of year it is, what the projections look like. And if you're close to a line and you're trying to avoid going up into it, I guess you could theoretically make some releases. And again, I think with the schedule, I'm trying to remember exactly where the low point on Zone BC is, about 16 and a half. So below that, we're probably not making releases generally. But again, it's, as Colonel said, we're going to take into account what's going on in the system at any given time to make smart decisions.
But right, but I think specifically, okay, if you're talking to the St. Lucie, the schedule tells us that, hey, we're not going above zero until that stage. That is a line.
Yeah.
That is a line that we're looking at and trigger, where we have flexibility within zone D. We wouldn't trigger above zero until we actually got to what we're calling zone BC, that kind of warning line that said, hey, we're getting on.
That zero is not flexible.
Right.
Yeah, and that is a very good thing for the St. Lucie estuary. I have a question about forecasting as well. The last question made me think of it. So all of the modeling you've done is on what's known as the period of record, which is what, like 50 years of data?
52 years.
52 years, okay. There've been questions about changing climate, perhaps increased rain in the future, which I think there's some widespread consensus on. So how can we know if we're basing these models on the period of record, the past 50 years, how can we know the next 50 years are going to look completely different or the next 10?
Yeah. So I'll lean on Tim. I know we've taken climate change into account, but
Right, yeah, especially when you're talking a short time into the future, 10 years, climate doesn't shift that drastically, typically within 10 years. Not something that we wouldn't have seen in the past 50 years. Something in the period that probably captures that. If you're looking at 100 years, it's a different story. But with this, we anticipate new infrastructure, relooking at the schedule in the next decade to account for that new infrastructure. Climate change likely doesn't have much of an impact. But I guess also to go with that, your ecosystems change with climate too. The amount of water an ecosystem might want would vary over time if you want to maintain a specific ecosystem. But that's a whole philosophical question that we probably don't want to get
Right,
into.
I know.
And I think what Tim's saying is for the life of this operating manual, it should be a fairly minimal impact and is accounted for and how we would operate.
I'm sure our commenters are blowing up right now.
Yeah, I want to be clear. We foresee this as a shorter period of operating manual. This won't last for 50 years under LOSOM.
And smarter people than me can explain the near-term impacts of climate change on rain patterns in Florida, but that's the answer that the Army Corps is.
We definitely see changes in rainfall even over the past 20 years, right? So, but it's all rolled into the climate and the modeling scenarios that we've done. It would capture a similar type scenario.
Okay, gotcha.
We'll adapt to it as we go.
We'll take another question, and I'll check the time here. Okay, Max Chesney, also a journalist on the Treasure Coast. He asks, to clarify Colonel Booth's earlier remarks, would it be accurate to say the lost summer of 2016 would be unlikely if the Corps was operating under LOSOM?
So two things. When I was referring to the lost summer, I was referring to 2013, where we think LOSOM would have had a fairly significant impact, where you wouldn't have seen a significant impact with harmful algal blooms, less flow. 2016, we would still have flows. We would just have more flexibility with harmful algal blooms. There's a certain amount of rain coming into the system that we can't shift.
That's helpful to hear, because when we think about that zero in Zone D to the east, it does sound like a cure-all, but it's not. When the lake gets above a certain level, all bets are off, certainly in Zone A at the highest levels. Thanks for the question, Max. Do we have another question? All right. John Sorry asks, why isn't the focus on the entry points to the lake, which initiate many of the issues? What LOSOM performance metrics are tied to upstream improvements?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a question we've gotten a lot from stakeholders, not only on LOSOM, but other projects. What about north of the lake? And I think one thing to consider, the Kissimmee River restoration, a huge success in terms of an environmental restoration project that we just completed construction on last year. That was a big focus before we even started SERP. So that project itself has a positive impact. Is there room for additional storage? When we look at the Lake Okeechobee watershed project, which we're currently in planning, things like that help. And is there a need for additional storage? SERP points to that. So I think that's always part of the conversation is additional storage north of the lake and what can we do to improve that. And that is even at the local level, as we all know, that impacts things as well. So it's a good question. I think that's one we all want to try to get after.
Well, let's get technical a little bit deep.
I thought we were.
So let's go a little more. So we have operating manuals for different areas in the system, right? And so we're in the process with Kissimmee is a different area. The Lake Okeechobee, LOSOM, covers Lake Okeechobee and the Caloosahatchee, the St. Lucie, and south, not completely south, but near releases to the lake. And then so operating manual for the Kissimmee area where I think he's referring to.
Sure. Yeah, and I think we're working on the first increment of the Kissimmee Headwaters schedule, which will be implemented next year, which will add some additional storage in Lake Kissimmee itself, which helps. And we'll continue to progress through the full Headwaters schedule, which adds 1.5 feet of additional storage on Lake Kissimmee to feed the restoration project itself. But that just completely changes the timing of water getting into Lake Okeechobee itself.
And you expect a net benefit from that so it flows into the lake?
Sure, I think it changes the timing. It doesn't necessarily change the volume considerably. I think the number, recall Lawrence Glenn from the Water Management District saying it was about only a 1% to 2% change in volume coming in, but the timing can change by 6 weeks or more coming in when you do have storm events. So I think that is significant. Of course, there's always room for additional storage, as we know that the systems change drastically from what it was naturally. So
Yeah, and that's a huge water quality issue too. I mean, the amount of pollution flowing into Lake Okeechobee is a big problem. We think a lot about that, and there's a lot of talk about storage north of the lake, including ASR wells, which drill deep into the ground. And at Friends of the Everglades, we do not support those for a variety of reasons, but kind of the most fundamental is that it doesn't address the need to restore the river of grass and get that water flowing south. So a lot of moving parts in this effort. I know you all have to have your hands in many of them. So we have time for probably a couple more questions, and then we'll have some closing remarks. Ed Keller again. All right. With LOSOM in a dry year, how much water will go south? I think you can spitball that.
in a dry year, that's a tough one. I'll recall 52 years in the period of record. But on average, the change in dry season flows to the south. We talked about 200,000 acre feet per year on average under LOSOM. About 114,000 acre feet of that would be in the dry season, which is a substantial increase over what we would see under LORS. So I think that's the best answer I can give with numbers now based on what I'm recalling. But a substantial shift would happen in releases in the dry season.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really kind of where we're focused, as you mentioned earlier. The constraints in the system are more or less removed during the dry season. You have an opportunity to move that water to the south where it's desired.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? If not, we'll roll to some closing remarks. All right, one more. Debbie Culp asks, the threshold for harm for the West Coast is 1,800 cubic feet per second. How is it shared adversity if you are allowing 2,000 cubic feet per second?
And so I believe the recovery metric, the metric that we use when you start to get into stressful flows, is 1,200 cubic feet per second. And that's why we base the flows at 2,000 cubic, up to 2,000 cubic feet per second.
2,100.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, you said
Okay.
1,200.
Yeah, I apologize.
Yeah, 2,100.
Thank you. 2,100.
Yeah.
So up to.
Okay, so you're under.
We're under it, about 100 under it. And that's up to. That's not saying we're always flowing that amount.
Yeah.
Right. Apologize.
I mean, I think it's an important question because earlier in the LOSOM process, there was a feeling that the West Coast was getting all of the adversity and the St. Lucie was getting more benefit. And East and West did come together and I think have some heart-to-hearts. And I think where you landed is pretty fair in terms of East-West. Now, we can debate the merits of water supply, which I know the Army Corps doesn't control. Certainly water supply is well protected in this plan, but I think in terms of East-West balance, you guys have done a pretty good job. All right, so we're gonna wind it up here, and I just wanna ask you about next steps. So we're, 3.5 years in? You just came out with these important draft documents, the plan. What comes next?
We want to talk through a little more detail than what I typically had.
Sure. Yeah. So the next steps, the comment period ends September the 12th. As the comments come in, we'll start looking at those, what we've already heard from all of our public NEPA meetings, and start thinking about what things need to be tweaked to kind of address some of those comments. And again, not changing the perspective on balance that LOSOM encompasses. We've worked way too long on that for that to change. But taking those comments and seeing where we can provide more clarity in the water control plan itself, add more detail to the EIS to explain things maybe a little better. So that's the next step. The final EIS is scheduled to be released in February. And typically, we would go draft, we'd get comments, go away, write, release it in February. That's not typically how we worked on LOSOM, and I don't think that's how we'll work going forward. We've heard a lot of really good feedback, and we'll want to get together with the PDT and with the public and kind of talk about, okay, here's what we heard, here's what we're thinking about, and how we can make things better in the document, in the water control plan, before we release the final. So we don't want it to be final and you haven't seen anything, you don't know what's going to change. And then the next step after it's released for the final EIS, it would go up to Atlanta, to our South Atlantic Division, and a record of decision would be signed, which would kind of give the approval to go ahead and start implementation. And then we roll right into implementation of LOSOM, assuming the dam safety ratings have been completed on Herbert Hoover Dyke, which they're scheduled to be. So we should be ready to roll by April of next year. And then, as we talked about a little bit, what happens then is the release decisions are made under LOSOM. We'll continue periodic scientist calls involving everybody, providing that forum for feedback. We'll have the 3 annual times where we get together and talk about philosophy for management over the next period. So that's kind of what it will look like as we move forward.
And then we'd have a new lake plan in effect next year. What month do you think?
Oh, April.
April.
When that record of decision is signed, that gives us the authority to use LOSOM.
What bumps in the road do you anticipate between now and then, Colonel?
Well, I mean, we've received good feedback. We think the basis of the plan is right. The feedback we've really been receiving is about language and giving people comfort in that language. And so that's where we're going to spend, I think, a significant amount of our time as that Tim described in changes. We're not going to see any holistic changes overall.
Anything else from you, Go?
No, I think we appreciate you guys coming in and telling folks here online. This is kind of a pivotal moment, right? I mean, this has been in the works for a long time, and it's going to be a big deal. It's going to be a big change for this community, I think, and it's welcome. Again, as we've said, there's some issues outstanding, but it stands to reason it's going to make a big difference for us. It's about time.
Right, it's overdue, and we appreciate the hard work on it. And for those of you listening who want to submit your comments, anyone can, whether you're part of a nonprofit like ours, or an individual, or a government agency, and all of those comments will be captured in the updated draft and responded to, right? You respond to every single comment. So if you want to know how to submit those, just check us out at Friends of the Everglades. We have that information on our website, or you can just Google LOSOM and you'll find the Army Corps of Engineers page with an email address. So it's important. We appreciate you tracking it. We appreciate Colonel Booth and Tim Geisen being with us today, and we'll stay tuned. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you.